You're listening to the Show Racism the Red Card podcast, challenging racism in sport and society. Welcome to episode 6 of the Show Racism the Red Card podcast. I'm your host, Jason Webber. In this episode, we are joined by former professional player and Show Racism the Red Card patron and education worker Sean Wharton to reflect on what has been another season blighted by racism. You can join in with the discussion or submit a question by emailing us at podcast@theredcard.org or by using the hashtag SRTRC podcast on social media. I hope you enjoy the show. Sean, welcome to the podcast. As the 2018-19 season concludes, it's a great opportunity for us to reflect on what has unfortunately been another season blighted by racism. What's your thoughts on last season's incidents? And actually, have we gone backwards in the fight against racism in football?
Hi, Jason. Thanks for inviting me. I think it's been a very difficult year in terms of racism. There has been a number of high-profile incidents, which has taken sort of, the limelight off some of the low-profile ones. But in terms of going backwards, yes, I think we have. It almost seems like we're going back to the 70s when racism was a regular occurrence.
Yeah, I mean, we've kind of spoken about, have we gone back 30 years? I think, while, I mean, particularly with the Aubameyang incident with the banana on the pitch, that kind of had that recollection of those dark times, really.
Absolutely. I mean, that happened to me in Newcastle in probably about 1986 when I was a young player playing in a reserve game, and exactly the same happened to me. So that was, 20, 30 years ago now, and exactly the same thing is happening. So it's unfortunate, and it's a shame that we've gone back to those sad times.
I mean, as you mentioned, there was a number of incidents last year, but I suppose some of the more high-profile ones have been the abuse that Raheem Sterling was subjected to in the match at Stamford Bridge, and also the chanting aimed at England players in Montenegro. Are the football authorities really taking a strong enough stance on racism in the game? Do they need to do more? What's your thoughts on that?
I think they do. I think, they are high profile. Raheem Sterling, for example, he's only 24. He's a young man with a lot of responsibility on his shoulders. And I think there's a lot of weight and pressure on him to be this leading light about racism. But there's, that incident you're talking about, there must have been, I don't know, maybe 20, 30 million people watching that game. And the same with all the others, 20, 30,000 cameras on them. Not everybody has that opportunity, and I think it's the people who don't have that opportunity to sort of fight against racism. They're the ones that we need to sort of support, as well as the high-profile players. But it is good that people like Raheem Sterling and the others are standing up against racism. And I think the authorities, like you said, they need to do much more than what they're doing.
Yeah, I mean, the Premier League obviously had their little No Room for Racism campaign towards the end of the season. There's been a lot of criticisms from players and other people around campaigns like that, even campaigns like Our Month of Action, warming up in T-shirts and kick it out actions as well. But I suppose, particularly with the Premier League one, is it sometimes seen as a bit of a tick box, or as if to show that we care and we're doing something, and actually is it more that is needed than that?
It definitely comes across that way. I think as a person who's experienced racism firsthand, you want action. You don't want words. You don't want to make an example of somebody, but you want people to take it seriously. And unfortunately, for a lot of people from BAME cultures, they do not believe that the authorities are taking it seriously enough to take appropriate action. And I think that's part of the issue. Yeah, sometimes it can be seen as a tick box, unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean, we will be talking about this in a bit more in depth in an episode coming up. But I mean, from our perspective, we've never said that wearing anti-racism t-shirts is the solution to challenging racism. Is part of a wider program, and it's more action, as you said, that we need from the authorities. And Danny Rose spoke recently about that. Nations can be fined as much as what he would spend in a night out. And I mean, is that the key thing? Is that when disciplinary action is taken, when there's enough evidence to put a case on, that the fines and the bans need to be a lot more?
I think they do. I also think that teams, clubs, authorities, they need to be proactive rather than reactive. This is an issue worldwide. This is an issue in football. We shouldn't have to wait for something to happen for action to be taken. And when things have come to light, I think there should be a very firm, hard stance on the individuals and the clubs. Whether it's monetary, I don't know whether monetary is the right answer. It needs to be education. There needs to be all sorts of things, put in place.
I mean, Raheem Sterling spoke last week to the Wall Street Journal and said about the fines, but said that he feels that a 9 point deduction is the way forward for clubs. I have certain worries around that. Is that if you have an individual, and I suppose fortunately, most of the incidents, particularly in the UK, are minority individuals or groups, as opposed to whole stadiums chanting. Is that then, something that is going to be punishing your fans who want to go to the game and have the right attitude and values and wouldn't clearly think about doing that? Is that then kind of affecting them, or is that actually something that's needed to set that strong stance?
I think it is. I think, when football is all about fair play, and I think you have to, it's not good to sort of treat everybody with the same brush, but I also think that action needs to be taken. What that action is, there needs to be discussed, it needs to be sat around a table, and it needs to be formulated, which is the best and appropriate way to deal with these issues. But what it cannot be done is it left and pushed aside, and just sort of, like you said previously, like just tick box it, find a club, X amount of money, and then move on. That's not good enough, and it's never going to be good enough. There needs to be positive action and planning in terms of moving forward, and education schemes, not just one, not two, on a regular basis at the clubs, including the players, including the managers, including the fans. They have to attend these certain sessions. But that's just off the top of my head. I think there's a lot more which could be offered, but it's a process which needs to be discussed.
And that's the key thing, is that the amount of money that's in the game, particularly at the professional level, and actually then the money that's being funded towards, not just anti-racism campaigns, but equality campaigns in general is nowhere near enough to really make a difference. And, while there are some good work that is going on from Showis Ricard, from ourselves and from other organisations like Kick It Out, I think that because of the limits of the funding, we're very much scratching the surface, really, and not, like you said, that proactive approach and having every coach that's going for the coaching badges, referees, all of the players from a young level having access to that education rather than leaving it to it being a reactive measures. And of course, FIFA a number of years ago kind of set about having a anti-racism task force, which, after a few seasons was disbanded, and they kind of thoughts were that it had achieved its goals. Well, clearly, if we're saying that we feel that football potentially has gone back 30 years and we're not making the progress that we feel should be there, then as an association, they believe that that's not the case. Maybe
absolutely right. I think there should be some sort of standard which every club should adhere to, whether that's like a hotel, 5-star, 4-star, 3-star, whatever it is. And in order to achieve the highest standard, they have to go through that certain process. And I think once they do that, then you can set a benchmark that this club is an anti-racist organisation. They are doing everything they need to do in order to sort of fight against racism within the football club across the board. And they're not just taking a tick box. What that standard is, again, needs to be discussed and formulated with the specialists and the people who work in that field. But that's one thing which maybe Show Racism Red Card could be looking at, that sort of that 5-star standard within clubs.
And of course, there's the equality standard for sport, which is, I think, along the lines of what you're talking about. But that's very much a focus on policies, and I think all too often they don't always translate to reality of what is actually happening at ground level. And I think that's more of what we want to see. But I think the key part from what we've been saying is that those fines or bans that have been given previously is not really strong enough to really put that a stance. So if you're a supporter, you're maybe really thinking twice about something that you're going to say. But of course, that level of education then is needed in addition to bans or fines.
Absolutely.
As well. As we mentioned, Raheem has been a kind of a real leading figure throughout the season, and a voice, I suppose, for a lot of the communities in standing up for victims of abuse. He's also spoken about the portrayal and representation of black players and the bias that potentially exists within the media. What's your thoughts on some of the key points that he's highlighted?
I think it's valid points, and like I said before, Raheem is a young man. He's 24 years of age with life experience, which is linked to sport and living a privileged life, which is great. You can't knock him for that. However, he's sort of been catapulted to this role, not through choice. Unfortunately, he had the experience he did, and I'm sure he would rather not have the experience and not be this ambassador for racism. However, he seems to be. It seems to have landed on his young shoulders. But there's a lot of footballers out there who experience racism, who are a lot older than him, a lot more experience than him. And I think we need to speak to and listen to them experienced people too, not just this young man who, let's be honest, wasn't so long ago the media actually hated. So it's amazing how things change. You hate them 1 minute and then they love them the next.
I think also, like, in addition to some of the black footballers and some of those players that have been abused and victims, I want to see more white players standing out, shoulder to shoulder with players like Raheem and kind of not only showing the support, after any incidents happen, but actually proactively throughout the year as well and continuing that conversation.
I think you're right. I think it takes a lot of confidence to stand up against racism. It's a subject people don't want to really talk about, and it's a subject that people feel uncomfortable talking about when they do. For people who are white and so on, they might not experience it directly, naturally, unless they tell somebody that they're from a different place. However, I think it is important that people, fight against racism regardless of the colour of their skin, nationality, culture, and religion. And we all stand together in that fight, not just the people who experience it directly.
And of course, one of the main comparison articles that Raheem spoke about was one of the white Man City players and one of the black Man City players, where for the article focus on the white Man City player, the kind of headline was that he buys a new £2 million home for his mum. And then for the black player, it was young Manchester City footballer 20 on 25 grand a week, splashes out on mansion on market for 2.5 million despite never having played a Premier League match. I mean, that does send out, a clear message of that differentiation and that differences and that portrayal of black footballers in particular.
Absolutely, and in terms of racial profiling, that sums it up naturally. And I'm sure there's lots more examples of that, but that is one clear example of how people are treated differently based on obviously the colour of their skin, and it's not acceptable. The media have a role to play, and they do, they do racial profile certain individuals in a category which will make people, become upset and anger and despise them purely because of the colour of their skin and the money they earn.
And I know Romelu Lukaku spoke out last year, around that very much point where, traditionally and even now we see headlines that, particularly black African players, very much their physical attributes are focused on, terms like beast and powerful, these sort of terms, as opposed to any kind of mention of their game intelligence or their kind of intellect as a person. What kind of impact can that have on players?
Oh, it's huge. It's a bit like sort of typecasting for an actor, isn't it? When they can't get a different role, they always play in a certain person. When players are put into that sort of category of being, fast or big and strong or whatever it is, again, it goes back to sort of the 70s when, if people think that every sort of black person is fast or every black person is strong, and every black person is good in the air, but that's across the board in sport, not just football. Unfortunately, it comes across more in football. But again, it's not acceptable, and it's not actually accurate.
One of the key things is the fact that there is actually such a lack of representation from BME individuals within the media, particularly in football and sports reporting as well. Does that kind of feed in then to some of these headlines where if somebody, was from those communities and experienced racism, might be more likely to question certain headlines and the certain spin on stories as well?
Absolutely. I think people should be given the opportunity to sort of succeed in every role that they do. And I also think that they should be given that opportunity on merit, not just on their skin colour, Unfortunately, it seems that isn't the case. Too many times, people are getting knocked back and not even given an opportunity for interviews or anything like that, and for no actual reason. In football, there's a lot of nepotism. We all know that. There's a lot of friendships, we look after each other to a degree. And it's hard to break that cycle, unfortunately. But it doesn't mean doesn't mean you stop doing it. You're going to keep trying, and there has to be more opportunities for BME people within football at every level, not just the lowest level.
And I certainly think there's definitely more need for more training for current reporters, and around unconscious bias and really starting that reflective process, that even for those that would never think they were racist or maybe are overtly racist,
Yeah.
but having those thoughts and those discussions and as organisations
I think it's
to
key.
do
I
that.
think, unfortunately, only in my opinion, we live in a too often selfish culture, and unfortunately, if it doesn't affect you directly, then it doesn't really matter. And I think for too many people, because it doesn't affect them directly, until it does, then they're not going to deal with it. So I think training and discussion is key in terms of moving forward, and again, attempting to eliminate racism within football. It's about open discussions, and until you have them discussions prior to events, then we're always going to be having these discussions about what we should be doing, when should we be doing it, who should we be doing it with, how much should be fine, is everybody being punished when they shouldn't be, because there's not enough discussion.
And I think that's key in it. Is that you mentioned earlier that for some people, talking about these issues, talking about racism, is difficult. And as a white person myself, it's taken many years working for an organisation to be comfortable to talk around these issues, especially when I've necessarily experienced it, particularly because of my skin colour myself. But it doesn't have to be. And I think it's having those conversations with people, kind of a diverse group of people, so that we are all comfortable about it, and actually then looking at what actions we can make and change moving forward to improve on a lot of these things.
I think you're right, and as you rightly said, you're a white guy and I'm a black guy, you're talking to me about racism, and that's key, because it is everybody's issue. I'm not gonna lie or try and make it sound any better than what it is, and I think it's important that people do respond to proactive in fighting against racism, and do whatever they can in order to fight against it, not just respond to it. And I think when the day comes when we stop responding to racism, hopefully that day will lead towards eradicating it.
There's been some people that have suggested that black players don't help themselves at a time, which particularly came to light when Moise Kean suffered racist abuse from the stands, when his teammates suggested he was partly to blame. What's your thoughts on individuals like Raheem and Moise Kean celebrating towards their abusers, when they've scored a goal, for example? And is this the best way to silence those racist behaviour?
Again, it really depends on personalities and character. People react differently in different circumstances. I don't think we can generalize about everybody's response being the same or everybody's response being different. You need a lot of confidence to challenge racism. You need a lot of confidence to talk about it. You need to be a big personality in order to fight it, and you need to be not afraid to speak up when sometimes you think nothing's going to happen. And I think those individuals you mentioned, I think they did the right thing, which was right for them. It wouldn't necessarily be right for everybody else because of their character. That doesn't mean that they wouldn't want to celebrate in that way. It just means their characters are different, like in everybody's character. So you have to take into account people's personalities, people's characters, people's experiences, and how that impacts on their family and how that impacts on their life, because we're talking about footballers, but ordinarily that they are just normal people with a talent, so their personalities and characters are going to be just the same as anybody else walking down the street. So it's key really that people find their own way in terms of fighting against racism if it hits them directly, and whatever that way is, whether it's walking off the pitch, whether it's down on the pitch, whether it's holding their ears up, whether it's crying, whether it's becoming upset, whether it's going home and speaking to their loved ones or their parents or their manager, whoever it is, then that has to be the right way for them.
And I think that's the key thing, is not kind of reacting angrily and lashing out, because then again that's not the right approach. But certainly reporting it is the key thing, and obviously on a professional level there's enough cameras and evidence there, but particularly at lower leagues, it's so important that the individuals and victims continue to report it, even though sometimes I appreciate it can feel that nothing's getting done, or the fines or the bans are not enough, or they don't come about completely anyway. But it's so important that we have to keep reporting it.
I think that's the key, but I mean from a black person perspective, and knowing a lot of people who have suffered racism, they do get tired of reporting things and nothing happening, and that sort of process almost wears you down, and you just think, well, you know what's the point? It's easier to live my life without having to sort of attempt to evidence things, because that's the key. People, when you do report racism, they want evidence, and then if you haven't got the evidence, you think, well, you got to believe what I'm saying. That's the evidence. Like, that gut feeling in itself should be evidence enough, regardless of trying to say to you that somebody said this to me. But you're right in what you're saying is, we have to report it. It has to be dealt with the authorities, and they have to be forced to make decisions. But unfortunately, they're not making decisions because people are not coming forward and saying this has happened. So we really need to get together, and if there is an incident, we need to report it to authorities and keep reporting it.
And I think that's the key thing, because particularly at those lower leagues where sometimes it's difficult to provide that evidence, or witnesses are not comfortable and confident in coming forward and sharing their experiences. Yeah. But I think by constantly reporting it can develop those trends. So if you have a particular team that's had 3 or 4 allegations made against them, then I think you can generally bet that there is an issue within that. And I think that's, I suppose, is the problem with just having reactive programs or reactive measures in place, which is why obviously we're calling for that more proactive side of it. So hopefully we don't get to a point where we get an incident actually happening. Moving forward, again, looking at some of the impact that some of these incidents can have. Danny Rose spoke recently about that he just can't wait to get rid of playing or get the back of football due to some of the experiences of racism that we've had. On our last podcast, Sol Bamba spoke about the impact that it can have on individuals at a human level, not just from a playing perspective. Is there more support then that's also needed for victims of racism, and education on kind of how they can deal with it and the best kind of procedures for them to take?
I think so. I mean, I think that we need to look sort of outside the box and provide these individuals with a level of aftercare and emotional support. Football has changed. There's sports psychologists. There's all sorts of people involved in the success of a football club and the success and the physicality of a footballer. But in terms of receiving racism and that trauma that it leaves you with and that emotional impact that leaves you with, nothing seems to be done. It's almost like, yeah, okay, you can be an ambassador, Raheem, because of the experience you had, but we're not going to really support you in anything, but you provide information for us, But the young man is, like, again, he's only 24 years of age. He's got a lot of life to lead, but very little years lived. So we need to provide footballers and everybody else, who are involved in sport and within society and the community with the opportunity to express their views openly and honestly in a confidential manner. And again, that's something which needs to be discussed with authorities. What are you doing, 1, to fight racism, and what are you doing, 2, to support the people who have received it?
And of course, there's been more of a focus in recent times around mental health, particularly within the game as well. And clearly there's a link between victims of racism and being abused and how that could impact on a player's mental health as well. And I suppose that's linked in with what you're saying, having that support.
And confidence, in terms of, being brave, getting on the ball, making a mistake, you make a mistake and people are criticising you. And again, I reiterate what I said, footballers are just young men, really, with a talent. So, when something gets to you, like everybody else, regardless of their profession, it's sometimes it stays in your head and it's embedded within your thoughts. When people are critiquing you just because of the way you look or the way you talk or the way you act. So it's vitally important that people just don't look at that and don't think about the fact that it's just racism on a field. People take that home, and they discuss it with their partners and their wives and their family, and they hold it too. So, although a few people might be, one person might experience racism on a football pitch, everybody then is impacted and affected. So it's a wider picture of how that one incident or them few words that are said in hatred, impacts a huge family of the individual.
So kind of, I suppose, looking on more the positive thing, moving forward then into next season and into 2020, how can we challenge racism in the game? What is it, the key things that are more that needs to be done?
Discussion, isn't it? Open discussion, frank discussion. I think education is a key, across the board, not just for those who are in a seat of racism, in terms of prevention. Lots of action is needed, not just a month or a day of action. It's got to be across the board throughout. It has to be on people's agendas continuously, not just when something happens, not just ticking a box and wearing a couple of t-shirts, but not actually knowing what that actually means, not being proactive in terms of fighting against racism. I think everybody needs to adhere to a particular standard, as what we said earlier. And when I say everybody, I mean clubs, players, um, supporters should be aware of the process. Staff, right across the board, every single football club, from grassroots up to the best team within the UK. If we're just talking UK wide, everybody should have the opportunity to have access to educational information and workshops or discussions.
I think one of the kind of really interesting key things for me throughout last season was some of the feature shows that Sky Sports News were doing on racism in football, highlighting what some of the real issues are, not just in the professional game, but at all levels as well, and some of the kind of specific topics that they had, including one around the media. And I think the one thing that it does do is, as you said, it keeps that conversation going, and I think that's where I suppose some of the criticisms have been of projects like our month of action, where just during October everyone's talking about it is very visible and then it goes away. I mean, that's not part down to our fault, but I think all too often, as you alluded to, that we have an incident that happens, and there was periods last season where there was 2-3 weeks on the bounce that instances were happening, and there was podcasts talking about it, it was in the news, it was on programs, and then it dies away and people forget about it and move on. So it's keeping that dialogue constantly going, and that's why, like I said earlier, we need more players, more people standing up and continually talking and addressing about this, so that it's continuously on the agenda until we feel that enough progress is being made. But I suppose the key thing is those, when those sanctions come in, they have to be at a stage where it really makes an impact on the club or the players or the fans, to really send up that stance that, if you do abuse somebody, whether you're a player, whether you're a fan, that it's going to have a big impact on your life.
Absolutely, there has to be a clear message from clubs and authorities that if that behaviour is being experienced or is displayed, then this is what's going to happen, and everybody should be clear. This is what's there's no grey area. There's no questions about what, when, who. This is the incident. This is the punishment. And people should be clear. But at the moment, it's a little bit ambivalent. Nobody really knows. The questions are: who heard it? When was it? Write a statement. Write another statement. Get witnesses. So the process is such a long, prolonged process. Like I said earlier, it does wear people down. But we got an opportunity to sort of make a stance here, because it is coming back to light. There are more incidents. People are having the confidence to speak up about it. So, I think time is of the essence, really, when, we got an opportunity, and everybody has an opportunity and a responsibility to not only talk about it, but to be proactive in what they do. And if they think that they're doing enough, then that's fine. But I think everybody could do more. Back in 1985, when I was talking about an issue, about a black issue, somebody experienced racism, I was deemed to be hung up on black issues. That was then. So when you get the same people talking about the same thing, people then, unfortunately, today are a bit shy away from it because they don't want to talk about it. But that's not what should happen. What should happen is we should sit down, we should talk about people's issues, talk about experiences, and work towards making it better for everybody. Not be fearful of racism, not be afraid to talk about racism, and not be afraid to challenge it.
I mean, there's no question that more action is definitely needed. I think when you've seen some of the examples this season, I mentioned again Aubameyang with the banana being thrown on the pitch. If you go back 8-10 years back to Samuel Eto'o, the chance that he had, you had Dani Alves had a banana thrown at him. Obviously, he reacted by picking it up and eating it. It does feel like we're not really making progress at all. But for us, I think the key is it has to be education is key. And I think we've seen the example of the Newcastle fan that was banned for life for some of the comments that he made, and I think there's certainly a place for that, and I think that does send out a strong message. But I think very much education is provided if we're using football as that tool to improve on issues in society and attitudes in society. Football is just a microcosm of society and issues that exist there. And I think banning somebody and kind of being like, well, they're no longer our problem. I think football can play such a important role in challenging issues in society.
Absolutely. I think every governing body within football should do more. It's an issue for some people right at every single level. Not just the highest level, but at grassroots level as well. And authorities, I think, they've got to do more. They have to do more if they think that this issue is a concern. If they don't, then keep doing what they're doing. Just be responsive, But if they do want to be proactive and send a message to people that this is not acceptable and this is what we're doing, then I think that's the way forward.
And I think there's certainly more accountability that is needed for the authorities, and hopefully players like Raheem and many others, hopefully, moving into next season and 2020, will be standing up and asking those questions to the authorities. And let's hope that more action will be taken. And come in a year's time, at the end of next season, when we're sitting down to reflect, let's hope there's been a lot more positives than what it has been from last season. Sean, it's been a pleasure to talk to you. Thanks for coming on the show. You have been listening to the Show Racism the Red Card podcast. Subscribe now to receive future episodes and help other people discover this podcast by rating us on iTunes.